Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. When we met in this hall last year, I was cautiously optimistic that the world would slowly but surely find its footing after the COVID-19 pandemic. My call then was to look forward and to focus on strengthening our resilience, on preserving the hard-earned development goals. Little did we know then that only 1 year later, we would find ourselves in a very different world, facing another crisis with tremendous global consequences. Consequences that actually reach beyond the pandemic. On February the 24th, war returned to Europe, when Russia brutally attacked Ukraine, an independent and sovereign country. Russia is trying to redraw borders using tanks and rockets, something the world hasn't seen since Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. It is using explicit nuclear blackmail and fake referenda in a clear violation of international law. This war of aggression against Ukraine destroyed many illusions. The illusion that the security architecture we had created after the fall of the Iron Curtain would continue to pay a peace dividend guaranteeing stability and security. That the European peace project would prevent war on our continent. And that crises and tensions can and would ultimately be solved by peaceful means, through dialogue and through diplomacy. Russia's attack was like a geopolitical ice bucket thrown at our face, brutally tearing us from our daydreams of a post-historical, post-national Europe. Deep within us, we clung to the belief that Francis Fukuyama might still be right with his end of history, at least as far as Europe was concerned. And we trusted that we had learned our lessons after 2 horrific world wars, after half a century of a Cold War and an Iron Curtain dividing our continent. Looking back, we have to admit that we were perhaps delusional, naive, yes, maybe even foolish. Indeed, our holiday from history is over. Ladies and gentlemen, many in this room might think now, why do the Europeans make such a noise, make such a fuss about it? They might point to the fact that war and military conflict are an everyday reality in many parts of this planet. And they might even accuse us of applying double standards, that we only react so strongly to Russia's invasion because of its geographic and cultural proximity, or because the Ukrainians look like us. I firmly reject such a narrative. Let me be very clear. This is a war in Europe, but it is not a European war. In fact, it is an assault against the rules-based international order, which we all have established together over the past decades. It is a flagrant and deliberate breach of the founding charter of this very organization, our United Nations. And in this charter of the UN, every single state in this room has committed itself to settle international disputes by peaceful means and to refrain from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. And what is worse, this breach has been committed not by any state, but by a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, the very organ which is meant to uphold the Charter, to ensure international peace and security. This puts into question the very foundations of our stability, of our security. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in a world in which the rule of law risks being replaced by the law of the jungle. And honestly, such a world poses a fundamental threat to all of us, especially to smaller countries such as Austria, countries that rely on international law as their shield, as their protective cloak against unilateralism and against the use of force. I firmly believe that the ideas and principles laid down in the UN Charter are as valid today as they were 77 years ago. Then, in 1945, in his address to the San Francisco Conference, the former US President Harry Truman said, and I quote, "We can no longer permit any nation or group of nations to attempt to settle their arguments with bombs and bayonets. If we continue to abide by such decisions, we will be forced to accept the fundamental concept of our enemies, namely, that might makes right." End of quote. These words, ladies and gentlemen, have not lost their truth and validity. Are we really incapable of learning from history? Because we are again facing a country which is attempting to settle its neo-imperialistic score using bombs and bayonets, and by targeting civilians and committing atrocities which may amount to war crimes under international humanitarian law. And these bombs and bayonets are not only targeting Ukrainians, no, they're also targeting the world's most vulnerable countries, pushing them into a triple crisis, a crisis of shortages of food, energy, and finances. And let me be very clear here. We should not confuse cause and effect. We have to put the responsibility firmly where it belongs. Some try to spread the narrative that this triple crisis of food, energy, and financing is somehow connected to the sanctions imposed by the European Union on the Russian Federation. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is simply wrong. To put it very clearly, there are no sanctions whatsoever on the exports of grain, oilseeds, or any other foodstuff, on the exports of fertilizers or on gas to third countries. Instead, it is actually the Russian Federation which is cynically using food and energy as a weapon, pushing millions of vulnerable people around the planet into poverty, hunger, and debt. According to the United Nations Global Crisis Response Group, the triple crisis of energy, food, and finance now affects 1.7 billion people around the planet. Not even the Soviet Union went that far. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, we are living through an era of transformation with the COVID-19 pandemic, the global food and energy shortages, the soaring cost of living, the rapid technological change, the climate change, and the prospect of a very bumpy road ahead of us as far as the world economy is concerned. These are scary perspectives indeed. No wonder that our citizens feel anxious and feel insecure. A storm is brewing. A storm that would seriously affect millions of people, especially those most vulnerable. This is a recipe for disaster, potentially leading to mass migration, social and political tensions. We rapidly have to take countermeasures, not only nationally, but in a global solidarity. This year, Austria is spending more on development assistance and humanitarian aid than ever before. And next year, we will even further increase our respective budgets. But we all know in this room that no government can shoulder these challenges alone. We desperately need a functioning multilateral system. We need a rules-based international order with the UN at its core. Our security depends on states respecting our sovereignty, our territorial integrity. Our political stability rests on the principle of pacta sunt servanda. And our economic prosperity requires functioning export markets and secure supply lines. The war in Ukraine is not a conflict of East versus West, or North versus South. The dividing line runs clearly between the rule of law and the law of the jungle. International law is valid for everyone, no matter the geographical, religious, or ethnic context. There is no first-class and second-class international law. Citizens need to be protected, whether in Mariupol or in the villages of Yemen. Fundamental freedoms and human rights, especially the rights for women and girls, need to be respected, whether in Crimea or in Kabul. Using hunger as a weapon is simply unacceptable, whether by blocking shipments out of Odessa or by preventing humanitarian aid from reaching the province of Tigray. There needs to be accountability for war crimes, whether they happen in Bucha or in Aleppo. I'm proud that Vienna is host to the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. And we Austrians will continue to actively support the efforts by the International Criminal Court to shed light into the savage acts committed in Ukraine. Effective multilateralism and the respect for the rule of law have been at the core of Austrian foreign policy for decades, symbolized by the UN headquarters in Vienna, and by our willingness to take on even more responsibility as a candidate to the UN Security Council at the elections in 2026. We count on your support. Constructive dialogue and pragmatic diplomacy will continue to be our guide. It is what Austria as an open and democratic society simply stands for. Ladies and gentlemen, I truly believe that we are facing the most challenging time of our political generation. Our actions today will shape the future of our international system, a system that rose of the ashes of two horrible world wars and the end of the Cold War. I'm not saying that the system is perfect, far from it, but at least it is a system where we are trying to create a world where the rights of all people and the sovereignty of every nation are respected, where we are trying to create a system where peace, sustainability, and social justice are possible. Obviously, these times are heydays for doomsayers. And yet, I remain confident that we can, yes, that we will prevail. Why? Because I simply deeply believe that our society is based on freedom, based on pluralism, based on individual rights, are remarkably resilient, and have proven so during the pandemic. Not despite, but because of our vibrant political debates. Not despite, but because of opposing opinions, of critical media and civil society. They are the key reasons, the key ingredients why we continue to innovate, to adapt, to learn from our mistakes, to rise in the face of adversity. I want my children and my grandchildren to be able to grow up in the world where rules are applied and respected, where they can live their lives in freedom and without fear, where might does not make right. Yesterday's speech by the Russian President Vladimir Putin made obvious that this conflict won't be over very soon. But let us not give in to fear, self-doubt, and defeatism. Let us be steadfast. Let us be ready to defend our values, the values of our United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the Federal Minister of European and International Affairs of Austria.